مرحبا جميعا في حلقة ثانية من حلقات بودكاست سوالف تغذية. أدري من زمان عن البودكاست، لكن اليوم عندنا حلقة مميزة باستضافة منو هنسلمانز بحلقة عنوانها Exercise Selection أو اختيار التمارين، والفوكس بيكون على الأبر بودي أو الجزء العلوي من الجسم. Enjoy. هاتلكم شيء تشربونه، شيء تاكلونه، سناك، لأن الحلقة طويلة ساعة تقريبا، فاستمتعوا وأتمنى أنكم تستفيدون. وشكرا. طبعا لا تنسون لايك شير وفولو. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Hello, Menno. How's it going? I guess this time you're in Madrid. Last time we spoke, you were in Amsterdam, I believe.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that was such a long time ago. I think like 6 or 7 months ago. Last time we spoke about protein and a general discussion about protein intake. And that, I guess, on both Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, we've gained so many views on that. And there was a lot of positive feedback. And I guess it has to be done again. We have to bring you back on this show. I guess first, let's talk about you. How are you? How are things in Madrid, I believe?
Yeah, I'm currently in Madrid. It's good. I'm very productive, doing more social media, working on an app that's going to be released later this year, a couple scientific studies that are likely going to be published this year. So, got a lot to do, very busy. Also, working on a lot of upgrades for my PT courses. So, lots of good things happening this year, I hope.
That's amazing. An app. That's such great news. Do you have like a concept of the app or something you can tell us about? It's exciting.
Nothing to share yet.
Okay. Understandable. How's your back, by the way?
Good, much better. After, I think last time we talked, I still had the back pain. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And yeah, I can front squat again, deadlifts, okay, not super heavy yet, but yeah, that's better than it's been in a long time.
Okay, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. I mean, last time you were avoiding completely deadlift and any back straining movements, but that's good to hear. I'm glad. Did you do anything specific for anyone who has like similar pain or something advice, I guess?
I think it's not so much about what you do as much as what you don't do. It's more about avoiding aggravating exercises or movements or even parts of daily life. Like for me, even walking or standing more than 3 minutes was a problem. And yeah, letting it heal. Time is the great healer. So I don't think there's, in general with rehab, there is no such thing as a healing exercise. Like there are some people who are woefully deconditioned and they just need to strengthen their tissues. But especially for a strength trainee, that is very unlikely. Most of the time, especially with overuse injuries, or at least biomechanical injuries, their tissue is damaged. You should stop doing things that aggravate that tissue because the stress tolerance of the tissue when it's damaged, it's torn or whatever, is much weaker. So you need to avoid making it worse or preventing healing, and you work around it. Active recovery works, like doing exercises that just promote blood flow, activate the immune system. That's all very good. And then it's just a matter of letting it heal. And for me, that's eventually also what I came down to. I just had to take a very big step back because at some point it was okay. And then I re-aggravated it with hip thrusts, which I thought they had to be okay, but it actually was much worse after that than even at the start. And then I had to just, for 2 full weeks, do nothing. Like I went to the gym on a kick scooter, and which was like 5 minutes, which was the absolute max I could stand. And no sex, no walking, no groceries, ordering everything, like nothing. And after 2 weeks of that, it finally was to the level where it would heal on its own with like daily life stuff.
Okay. I mean, that's such great news to hear. I remember I had, I wouldn't say similar, but back in 2019 or 2020, I strained my back, like basically the right half of my hip and below. I had this aggravating pain that doesn't go away. And I remember one of the worst things I've ever done was actually trying to get, like, I thought it was like something simple that can be solved by massage or something like that. And that was the worst decision ever. I think I made it worse by doing massage. And I just have to basically just sit or do anything that doesn't strain this part for like 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden it's just starting to get better. I mean, like with anything that basically, I'm not sure what's it called, but those stickers you put on the back that reduce inflammations. I think that was one of the best things that helped me. But this is not, I'm not sure if we had the similar problem, or I'm sure. I mean, it's different. But anyway.
Yeah, massage is funny because many people have this idea with massage and stretching too, that these are like good things that can only be good. Maybe they don't work, but for sure they are at least neutral and maybe they're good. But I know a lot of people who have made their injuries worse with stretching or massage or excessive manual therapy. I mean, you're still putting, with massage, it's just a lot of pressure on an area. So there's no reason, like, why would that not be able to aggravate an injury? Like, if you have a bruise or some other injury, you're gonna poke into it with your thumb. Could it get worse? Of course it could. So you have to be careful with these things as well. There's, like I said, there's no such thing as just, healing stuff. Well, the closest to that would be injecting growth hormone probably. But even that really doesn't do that much.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so we can get to the topic of our discussion today. I believe I chose today exercise selection because it's been such a hot topic in the last couple of years. I mean, I guess nutrition, at some point, it reached the peak where we know what to do exactly for weight loss, for weight gain, how much protein we need. Now in nutrition, I believe it's about fine-tuning these numbers. And we have the range, but we're trying to get point something of that range. However, in exercise, I believe there are still a lot of information or misinformation, I would say. And this podcast or this episode, I would like to pave the way for whoever wants to start working out, and just to have a clear path on how to structure his workouts or his exercises based on his goals. So ideally, I will go through each muscle and we'll see how far we go. Maybe this will be a 2-part series because I don't think we can cover everything in one sitting. So let's kick things off with the bro's favorite muscle, the pecs or the chest muscle. I'll let you talk about it, and you can maybe talk about origin, primary movements for these muscles, and the exercises you would choose for each of these muscles. So go ahead. Let's start with the chest muscle.
Yeah, chest. So the pecs have an upper and a lower part. It's good to differentiate between those because they have somewhat opposing functions. The function that they share is horizontal adduction or flexion. So basically like crunching the elbows together, which you do in a bench press or a dumbbell bench press, a fly, all these movements. And the most horizontal movements in my view are generally the best. That doesn't mean you do a flat press though, because if you're doing a flat press and you're arcing your back a bit, which is what most people do, you're retracting the shoulder blades, you're actually slightly decline. So I like a 15-degree incline, and I typically prefer dumbbells over barbell. Barbell is also great, but dumbbells, you can just get a little bit more range of motion. It's easier on the shoulders, and you can get that stretch, which we know from the research from the past years is extremely important because it can stimulate stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And then most of the standard exercises are good. I'm a big fan of push-ups as well. I think most people are a little bit too much on doing all of their pressing with their scapulae fixed. So their shoulder blades are like fixed to a chair or the bench or whatever. And the body moves very well when it can move freely. So during a push-up, which is a closed kinetic chain exercise, the scapulae are free to move. And a lot of people experience a lot better shoulder health when they do these, as opposed to always doing bench presses, which for many people really takes its toll on the shoulder at some point.
Okay, so one of the most common questions I get regarding the pecs or the chest muscle, that how many should you tackle the upper angle or the lower pecs or the upper pecs, or just doing horizontal push, or does it cover all the muscle fibers?
I think that you cover pretty much all the fibers if you do horizontal type pressing. Decline pressing I'm not a big fan of because most people have issues developing the upper chest, and the lower chest, if anything, gets overdeveloped. I think most people probably do a little bit too much kind of decline pressing. A standard push-up, if you think about it, is actually a decline press. And like I said, a standard flat bench press, if you're arching, is actually also a slightly decline press. So a lot of people actually unwillingly do most of their pressing decline. And also when they do a cable crossover, they like do the kind of the most muscular pose. It's a very, very decline type movement that's focused on the lower pecs. So I'm not a big fan of really targeting the decline. Dips, again, really hits the lower chest. Upper pecs, there is something to be said for that. But most research finds that if you look at what happens when you do an incline press, and the same for a decline press, is that you're not increasing the activity much, like a little bit, but very little, in the upper parts. Like if you do an incline press, the upper pecs get a little bit more activity depending on which study you look at. But the lower pecs get a lot less activity. So it's not really that you're hitting the upper pecs better, it's mainly that you're hitting the lower pecs worse. And I think that you already hit the upper pecs and the lower pecs quite a bit with other exercises like chin-ups. They also actually hit the lower pecs. Many people forget that the lower pecs also aid in shoulder extension and pullover type movements. All these things, they also hit the lower pecs. Not necessarily an optimal exercise for that, but they still target the region, so those fibers will be activated. And then the upper pecs, they get hit with almost any kind of front raise, even a little bit with a lateral raise, depending on how you perform it. Overhead pressing, if you're not fully, like your arms are not fully out to the sides, also hits the upper pecs. So there are a lot of exercises typically that hit the upper versus lower pecs a little bit. And I think the most of the pec work that you have to do, also because you're already getting that extra volume, is in or near the horizontal pressing plane.
Okay, it's funny because you mentioned the dips, and I'm not a big fan of chest dips. Honestly, I feel like they strain my joints. They put a lot of stress on my joints, especially the soon you start loading weights or you use the chains and you start putting on weight, you can really feel it in your joints. So this is a pass for me. And another thing I come across is flies in general. Are they a necessary chest exercise, you would say, in a program?
They're not necessary, but I like Bayesian flies a lot, which is a fly that's done with cables and you internally rotate the shoulder. So instead of holding it like this, you do like this. And which is kind of what you do with a bench press. And most people feel that because you're rotating the shoulder, and therefore if you look at the pec fibers, they are kind of stretched over the shoulder normally like this. And when you internally rotate the shoulder, you align them much more directly with the movement. So the line of pull of the movement is the same as the line of pull of the muscle fibers, which is typically when you get the highest muscle activity. There's no direct research on this, but most people like them, and actually they're surprisingly easy on the shoulders for a lot of people, even though they're in internal rotation. So yeah, I like those a lot, but any type of fly can work. And a big benefit of flies is that they can allow you very well to overload the stretched position. Now you can do this with a dumbbell. With a dumbbell, it's probably a little bit overkill because then you're kind of only overloading the bottom position. But with a cable, for example, it's a really good way to overload the bottom part and isolate the pecs, of course. Whereas with dumbbells and barbells, you're kind of hitting the triceps, but not very well, which is, we'll get into that later. It's actually an issue because you're training the lateral fibers of the triceps a lot, but not so much the long head. So you're actually kind of overtraining one part of the triceps and undertraining another part in many programs. And flies allow you to just hit the pecs. Pec deck can also work well. Then you are taking the shoulders out of it a little bit. If you externally rotate the shoulders, then you don't engage the front delts as much, which can also be beneficial because a lot of people overwork those as well.
Yeah, that's true. And it's especially for the front delts, it's a game of not overtraining it in a typical program rather than actually hitting the volume, because it's all in almost any chest movement, you will move the front shoulders, and then you have any push movements. So you'll still also move the front delts. That's very interesting. Okay, since we talked about the triceps, let's get on to the triceps, I guess. So I feel like it's necessary to explain passive and active insufficiency when we're talking about the triceps, since it's a biarticulate muscle. And could you give an example on each of those and how this affects the working or the muscle function of the tricep?
Sure. So muscles have what's called a length-tension relationship, which means that the amount of tension the muscle produces depends on the length of the muscle. And the amount of tension a muscle produces is extremely important because tension on the muscle, mechanical tension on the muscle fibers, is the primary, probably actually exclusive stimulus for muscle growth. There is some speculation about muscle damage and metabolic stress, but it's mostly theoretical and there's very little hard data to back that up. Most research is consistent with really that mechanical tension on the fibers is the growth stimulus, probably the one and only growth stimulus for hypertrophy. So if we know what maximizes tension on the muscle fibers, that is essentially the goal of exercise selection, to select exercises that put as much tension on the target musculature as possible. Now, due to the length-tension relationship, there is usually kind of an optimum curve, where there is a certain length where the muscle is the strongest, and then if you stretch it out a lot, it becomes weaker. If you shorten it a lot, it becomes a lot weaker too. Now this varies per muscle, so it's good to know what every muscle's length-tension relationship is. But for the triceps, you can actually get it so short and so long, especially the long head, that it's basically inactive. So the long head is also active at the shoulder. It's like a little helper of the lats. It helps with shoulder extension, pulling the elbow down. So what you want to do typically for the long head is to have the elbow overhead, because that stretches it, and that allows you to induce stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Now, stretch-mediated hypertrophy is something that you get when you're training it at a long length, but probably not at full passive insufficiency. So passive insufficiency means that the muscle is so long that it's very weak, and basically it cannot fully contract anymore. So if you think of how a muscle contracts, the actin myosin sliding over each other, the sliding filaments, that process of the muscles, the filaments sliding over each other, that's how it shortens. So if you think of this, now the muscle is more short. If the muscle is very long, then you're pulling these myofilaments so far apart that they cannot contract anymore. They cannot join hands. And that's what happens with passive insufficiency. And with active insufficiency is when the muscle is so short, which you could get with the triceps, but it doesn't really occur much. You get it a little bit with a kickback. If you have the elbow way out to the back and then you try to fully extend the arm, you can actually tell, if you do that, you pull the elbow way back and you try to extend the arm, you'll notice that you cannot pull the elbow quite as far back. It's a small difference for most people, as when you're just pulling the elbow back like a row. So if you also try to extend the arm, you'll notice that the long end of the triceps gets too bunched up, it gets too short. So the actin and myosin are cramped up together, and there's no room for them to form cross bridges anymore because they're just cramped up against each other. And that's a position you definitely want to avoid for most exercises, because you can't produce much tension, and there's also no stretch-mediated hypertrophy.
Okay, so in the same context, I two questions are in my mind right now. So the first one, doing a lat prayer. This is an obvious tricep exercise because you can really feel the tricep working, or per se, let's talk about the long head of the triceps specifically. Yeah, and you can really feel it. But would you say it's the motion or the position of the triceps in a lat prayer? For example, fully extending the elbow and while doing the lat prayer, does it put the triceps in a passive insufficiency?
No. So it would go close to active insufficiency in the bottom if, and this is not possible with straight arms, you would get the elbows behind the body. So you really have to get maximum, or the shortest possible muscle length, which is the elbow way behind the body. Not a little bit, but all the way back, and then fully straighten the arm. Then you get active insufficiency. And passive insufficiency you wouldn't get, because at the top you would have to also flex the arm. So you'd also have to stretch the triceps at the elbow, which you're not doing with a lat prayer. You're keeping the arm either fully straight or close to straight. So with a lat prayer, you don't go into either range. Most exercises for the triceps, they won't go into full active or passive insufficiency. It's the position of when you're doing an overhead tricep extension and you're doing it like this, and you really focus on getting the elbow all the way back, and then you get the arm all the way down, then you also notice you are extremely weak. And it's because the long head can do very little. It may still be okay to do that sometimes, because you're stimulating a whole lot of passive tension on the long head. So it may actually kind of balance out okay if you also have other triceps work for the long head in the program. Because then you're banking more on passive tension and stretch mediate hypertrophy with that exercise, and then other exercises stimulate more active tension. And like I said, the active insufficiency, that's what you mostly get if you're doing like a kickback with the elbow way behind the body. So kickbacks in general are not a great exercise, because they really don't stimulate the triceps at short lengths. They're not great for the long head. And if you do them like with your elbow way up, then you're even going into active insufficiency, which is also why you're so weak when you do that. If you try to do a kickback with your elbow all the way up behind your body and you really fully straighten the arm, then you're going to be lifting pink weights very often. Because that's the active insufficiency at play.
Yeah, that makes sense. That completely makes sense. Yeah. And for example, exercises like a skull crusher, if you do it the regular way, you're just moving your elbows. But for example, if I take the weight back behind my head, does that work the long head of the triceps as well?
Yes. So I like to call those skull overs instead of skull crushers.
I mean, yes. Makes sense.
Yeah, there you go. Over the skull instead of crushing the skull. And they're kind of a skull crusher meets a pullover. So it works both ways. So yeah, skull overs, not to be confused with skull crushers. Then you're activating the long head more for two reasons. One, you're stretching it more. When the elbow goes back, you stretch the long head more. And then secondly, when the elbow goes back, then as we discussed, the long head also helps the lats. So it actually also helps pull the elbow back. So you're activating this motion itself, like bringing the elbow up like this, activates the long head of the triceps. So you get kind of double extra return on investment. Plus, it's much, much easier on the elbow for most people. Most people, they get a lot of issues with skull crushers. I often joke that skull crushers are better called elbow crushers because not many people actually end up injured on the skull, but a lot of people get elbow pain from them. And skull overs are a lot safer on the elbow because you're kind of avoiding that position in the bottom where you have a lot of tension in the elbows all the way like this. It's safer to just get the elbow back a little bit, even if that comes at the expense of a little bit less muscle tension. It's better to have the muscle tension you can manage than a bit more muscle tension but then get injured as a result.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I used to do a lot of overhead exercises for the triceps, and then at some point that specific position where you put the tricep and it becomes really difficult to pull. I wanted to change that. So I went to start with the skull overs, as you call them. And I noticed it's more time efficient for me at least. And especially with my busy schedule, sometimes doing unilateral exercises takes a lot of time. So I prefer doing both muscles at the same time. But of course, not everything I can do that. We'll get to that, I guess, in the different muscles. I'll talk more about that. Okay, I guess we covered everything about the triceps, I believe. Okay, so let's move on to the antagonist muscle of the triceps, the biceps. So we have two heads of the bicep, the short head and the long head of the biceps. And I'll let you take over. Let us know what...
Yeah, so the short head, the inner head, long head, the outer head. Even textbooks sometimes confuse the two. But it's the short head that's actually also active at the shoulder. So if you raise your arm, like in shoulder flexion, or a front raise, it technically trains the short head of the biceps. It's very weak there though, so it's not a big issue, but it means that you generally, also to avoid that the muscle shortening too much, you want to keep the elbow at your side. And another issue is that the biceps is a relatively unique muscle because it's strongest in the position where it's relatively long. In fact, it's the strongest almost at its maximum length. If you think about resting position, where you're just standing upright in military posture, your biceps are stretched. They're at your sides, so they're not flexed at the shoulder. They're relatively stretched at the shoulder, and your arms are straightened, So the biceps are stretched in that position. And in that anatomical position, the biceps is approximately in that position the strongest. So you actually want exercises, especially for the biceps, that train the muscle at long lengths, because you get the highest, not only passive tension, which every muscle gets when it's lengthened, like in the triceps, like we have the trade-off, right, between active and passive tension. With the biceps, you get both in the bottom position. Now, as it turns out, the way most people do their curls, dumbbell curls, barbell curls, that's all max tension at 90-degree elbow flexion, and there's actually no tension when the arm is straightened in the bottom, because the moment arm, the external moment arm, is zero. There's no leverage of the dumbbell, right? It's pulling your elbow down, whereas the biceps wants to perform this movement, like 90-degree upward rotation around the elbow joint. So for most people, they are completely neglecting the very most important position for the biceps. And as a result of that, I think that the exercise I like the most is the Bayesian curl, which is a cable curl, but unlike the way most people perform their cable curls, is you face away from the cable tower. So almost everybody, when they're doing cable curls, they're facing the cable tower, and then you have the exact same problem, even worse in fact, because there's still no leverage in the bottom position. Like you could literally just let your arms relax in the bottom position, and it will be basically zero tension on the biceps. Just like in a dumbbell or a barbell, like you can feel it, you can just, in the bottom position, you can rest. You can literally relax in between repetitions. Now with the Bayesian curl, because you're facing away from the cable tower, there's still tension in the bottom position. And by stepping forward, it actually becomes quite a lot of tension. So you overload the bottom part, and then by leaning a little bit forward, you can also still overload the top position. So you get nice, constant muscle tension throughout the entire range of motion, and especially the bottom position, where you get the highest active and passive tension. So it's kind of a perfect biceps exercise.
Yeah, Bayesian curls have been, ever since I finished the course, your course, this exercise has been a staple in all of my clients' workouts. Like every single client has to have this exercise. And whenever they ask about why do I need this exercise and why this exercise specifically, I'm like, okay, this exercise will cover all the parts of the biceps, like starting from the stretch position to the 90 degrees, and you'll have maximum contraction on each one of them. And if you don't like it, this will cause your workout plan to have 3 or at least 2 different exercises to focus on different angles of the biceps. For example, I can give you a Pirscher curl, so you can have the completely upward position of the biceps, and I can give you another exercise that can work the stretched position of the biceps. If you want to save time, let's just stick to this one. And I haven't had anyone complain about this exercise. As soon as they know how to perform it properly, it feels really good to the biceps as well. And if you're chasing the pump, this is a perfect exercise for that.
Yeah, it does both, right? The pump and the stretch.
Exactly, both. And for the details freak, and I got this question from those who are chasing the details. For example, the 2 heads of the biceps, when should you care about which one to focus on more?
Rarely. You rarely care about that. You mainly care about the short head, training the short head well by keeping your elbow at your side. So you have all of these exercises, you're doing curls like this and curls like this in the biceps position. For some reason, guys in the gym get insanely creative when it comes to biceps isolation exercises. Like they do the same stuff year in, year out for every muscle group. But no, when it comes to biceps isolation exercises, they do like 7 variants, lying down with the cable, standing up, weird poses. Like, yeah, the Arnold poses. It's crazy. And it's really
even
not
on
a
the
muscle
lats pull down.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really not a muscle that needs that much variation, because like I said, Bayesian curls are essentially perfect. They're not a very complicated muscle. So just some exercise like that, and then you get the work you get from chin-ups and the like. You're pretty much covered for most intents and purposes. You can play around, for more advanced trainees with pronation, supination, neutral position, hammer. You can do Bayesian curls as well with a hammer grip, with a pronated grip, like a reverse grip. So You can add some variation in like there, but you really don't need that much of it, and especially not in the same program. So I think there's this idea of changing the peak of the biceps. For most people, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this. I'm not sure if I caught it or not. So which head of the biceps is mainly responsible for, or dominantly responsible for, the shoulder flexion?
The short one, the inner one. So the one that's
The short
closer,
head.
the closer
Okay.
here. Yeah.
Okay, last one for the biceps, and especially with counting the volume of the bicep, because it's in every pulling, or not every, but most of the pulling exercises, there is some level of bicep work in it. For example, chin-ups. I completely count the volume towards the biceps because you can feel the activation of the muscle in the chin-up if you do it in a full range of motion. And for example, when it comes to rows and any exercise that has basically that moves the biceps or a pull down, a regular pull down, how do you differentiate on how to count the bicep? Is it half a volume? Is it one, or is it a complete set towards the biceps?
Yeah, that's an area where we currently we're just scratching the surface of that. I'm actually in the process of doing what I think will be a really, really cool study on hip thrust versus squats, together with Brett Contreras and some other researchers. And we don't have that many studies that directly compare muscle growth for different exercises. So we rely a lot on EMG research, biomechanics, and some indirect findings. There are studies on muscle damage, how much muscle damage is induced by an exercise, for example, how much, like biomechanically, how much tension there is in these positions. So we rely a lot on those things. Like for the triceps, we actually have studied directly now that shows that overhead tricep extensions stimulate significantly more muscle growth than pushdowns. So what we just talked about, these biomechanical principles, which is what I've very long advocated. And so it's great to see that we now actually have research that validates these principles. For the biceps, we also have a few studies. We know that chin-ups and even wide grip pull-downs, according to one study, it's by Paulo Gentile from Brazil, who doesn't have the best reputation after his association with data frauding scandal in Brazil. But he was never like officially called out or anything. So we, based on the data we have, that's what we should go by. And it found that even wide grip pull-ups or pull-downs are as effective as, I think, barbell or dumbbell curls. I can't remember which one. I think they're barbell curls. In contrast, we also have a study that found that dumbbell rows are considerably less effective, like half as effective as biceps curls. And that makes sense because one thing that the biceps and the triceps have in common is that with barbells or fixed implements, they can be a lot more effective due to horizontal force production. It's a little bit complicated to explain, but basically, if during a wide grip pull down, you can kind of move the biceps, you can exert force on pulling the bar inward. And because if you're pulling the bar inward, like the bar is fixed, you're not going to crush the bar unless you're the mountain. So what happens is you pull the weight down, like that force essentially gets transferred into downward movement. Biomechanically, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's intuitively how you can think about it. And the same for a bench press. If you're pressing outward on the bar, since the bar can bend, that pushes the bar up. So based on these things, you can, with a fixed implement, activate the arms a lot more than with a dumbbell or a single cable. So with a dumbbell row, there really isn't that much, you cannot have that horizontal force production, and because you would move the dumbbell out to the side because it is not fixed in place. And you also don't have a lot of direct demand for elbow flexion. Like there's no elbow extension torque from the weight, pretty much. Especially as long as the dumbbell is directly below the elbow, there's no direct demand on the biceps. So it's, just not a great exercise for the biceps. Chin-ups, probably, yes, I would count them 100%. So based on this research, rows and stuff are like 50%. And then you get to something like high rows or face pulls. I mean, if you want to be precise, probably that would be like 25% because it still activates the biceps. But I think often you can just ignore it for the sake of simplicity. Maybe because if you don't cross a certain threshold, I think that's like 40% of MVIC in EMG research. The stimulus is essentially too low to stimulate significant muscle growth. So you don't have to worry about an exercise stimulating 10% versus 20%, Probably based on that, if it's below 40% or below half, you can kind of round it to zero. So yeah, and then of course all the curls count 100%. The tricky thing is, like with the triceps, we know that overhead tricep extensions are a lot more effective than pushdowns, but they both really train the triceps well. So we kind of also have to worry about the muscle length, right? So something like a preacher curl or a Bayesian curl is probably a lot more effective than a dumbbell curl. But are you actually going to count the dumbbell curl as 80% or something in a program? Then you have to make a lot of assumptions and it gets very complicated. So typically I count an exercise as fully or half, and I make sure that you tick all the boxes for a muscle. That's most important. Because if you look at research, what we have on the adding of isolation exercises to compound exercises, for example, we see that you don't have to do everything perfect with every exercise for all your volume. Like if you have some exercise that's maybe not optimal, but you have some other exercise that does tick all the boxes, stimulates stretch mediated hypertrophy, super high active tension, good range of motion, etc. Then if you have some other volume in the program, it kind of rounds it out. You don't have all of your volume, you don't need it to hit, because you're kind of also hitting the same fibers then probably. So yeah, based on most research, what we have is as long as you have some exercises that stimulate the passive tension, the stretch mediated hypertrophy, and really target those most fast twitch muscle fibers, make sure you get really high muscle activity, then the rest of the volume can just get okay muscle activity, because you're stimulating, the type 2A fibers, the type 1 fibers a bit more. You also want to stimulate those.
Yeah, and that makes sense actually. And it's funny you mentioned the triceps, and especially when you have you counting volume towards the long head of the triceps and counting volume towards, would you call it the medial or the lateral head of the triceps? And do you count volume for each separately, or you just count pushing exercises as half, and then the other half is compensated by the long head exercises?
I count it separately. I count long head and medial and lateral volume. Like medial and lateral, I count them together. It's mainly the lateral head really, like the head in between it's relatively small, it's not that visible. So you kind of just think about it as the lateral head. But yeah, the long head I count separately, because exercises like lat prayers, they hit the long head but don't hit the other heads sufficiently. And then you have exercises like the bench press, because of the biarticulate muscle conflict, like the elbow. The long head is essentially pulling the elbow down a bit as well. And we know from research now, it was a great study by Brandau et al. That shows a bench press, like a barbell bench press, is great for the lateral head, but really poor for the long head. And on average, in research, we see that bench presses and push-ups stimulate about half the growth of tricep extensions and direct triceps isolation work. So that explains it. It's probably, you're activating about half of the musculature very well. But yeah, to make sure that your program gets rounded out, you technically can just say it's half. If you have overhead tricep extensions in the program, it's fine. Some students I say, look, if it's too complicated, and you just count it as half, and you'll be okay as long as you adhere to all the other principles. But if you want to be precise, then you do need to count, for example, lat prayers, because how else do you count the lat prayers? Are those half as well? And if you just do 20 sets of bench presses, that's still crap for the long head, especially if it's dumbbell bench presses. So it doesn't make a whole, you need something else to compensate for that volume. But yeah, just counting it half is pretty okay, as long as you, like I said, adhere to these other principles as well.
Yeah, I think that covers it for the biceps, and we tapped back into the triceps. We're taking these conversation going with it. I'm enjoying this. This is really fun. Okay, so it makes sense to move to the shoulder, I guess, because we spoke about it here and there. So let's get it out of the way. I believe shoulder has three sides or three main muscles: front delts, lateral delts, and the rear delts. Front delts, as we mentioned earlier in the, I would say, podcast, they're already moving in most of our push exercises. So our focus on these should be on mainly towards the lateral head, I guess, more than the rear delt, because you have pulling exercises that also work the rear delt. So you can go on.
Yeah, the short or the anterior head, the front part of the delts, I typically don't even bother training, because you're going to hit it all of your overhead presses, all of your horizontal presses, basically all your chest work, like I said, except maybe back deck flies with very high external rotation of the shoulder. You don't hit the front delts much, but yeah, it's gonna get hit a lot. Now the lateral delts, they don't get hit nearly as much as people think, because most people have the idea that if they do an overhead press, for example, or a standard lateral raise, they are taught to do it in a scapular plane, so it's actually a bit more of a front raise, it's like 30 degrees to the front. Also, most people intuitively, when they do a lateral raise, like they stand up straight with a dumbbell, and then their arm gets kind of forward, their arm is a little bit bent, for one, which moves the dumbbell forward, which kind of has the same effect as moving the elbow forward. And then they also move the elbow a little bit forward, because for some people it feels better on the shoulder, or they're taught to do that. And then if you look at the angle of the fibers, like when it's like this, then it's mostly the front fibers of the delt that are active. And even if you're doing a lateral raise with the elbow all the way out to the side, this is still a lot of the front fibers. Like you can see, if your delts are big enough and you do like this, you can see the different heads. And in this position, this is like these fibers, these are the lateral fibers. These get hit, but these are all front fibers. So I like to do most of my delt work really focused on leaning a little bit forward and really making sure those lateral fibers, the top fibers, are in line with the exercise. Because we know from the literature that the delts can actually be divided into 7, 9, 11. Some research have a lot of different opinions. There are 3 main heads, but there are at least, I think based on latest research, at least 11 different neuronal compartments that can be activated separately. So it's almost a continuum of the fibers, and it's the fibers that are the most directly in line with the exercise. Those are the fibers that you're going to hit the most. So bending over a little bit forward, like you can literally see for yourself, making sure it's those lateral fibers that are in line with the exercise and then moving straight out to the side. That's a great way to target the lateral fibers. You can also move the thumb down a little bit, internally rotating the shoulder. You have to be a bit careful with that for shoulder health, but as long as it feels fine, you don't go up too high, it's generally okay. And then the rear fibers as well, you want to, you hit those with pulling exercises, so you don't need to worry as much about it. But the lateral fibers for sure. Also with overhead pressing, you want to make sure that your elbows are really out to the sides. Because if you think about how most people overhead press, many people sit, and when they're sitting, they're kind of doing a high incline press. They're not sitting fully upright. Because for one, the bench often doesn't go fully upright, and if you are, then you can't sit comfortably. Now, I'm not a big fan of sitting in general, in part because of that, and also because we literally have a study showing that you get greater muscle activity when you do the exercise standing. Probably in part because of the higher stabilization requirements, maybe also because the shoulder's free to move, and because it's easier to keep the elbows all the way out to the sides. And you can do that very well with dumbbells. So it's a shame if you use dumbbells and you don't go A, all the way down, and B, all the way out to the sides. Again, as long as your shoulders are happy with this. And even if you're using a barbell, you want to make sure that you're having shoulders way out, the elbows way out to the sides. Really focusing on this kind of motion, not on a front type press.
Okay, that's really interesting. So when you say go all the way to the sides, would you say, so for example, if our baseline is the shoulders, would you say double the shoulders or triple or 2.5?
You want to go pretty wide.
Okay.
Yeah, so the ideal grip width, I would say, is at a minimum, where in the bottom position, your forearms are vertical. So basically as far out as your forearms are still vertical, and you can even make them a little bit more out to the sides. Then it becomes kind of a snatch grip overhead press. And you'll feel that when you move the arms out further to the sides, then your elbows will dig in further towards your body, and you'll feel the stretch more in the lateral delts. And that's great. You may actually stimulate some stretch meaning hypertrophy.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so basically, for a lot of people, I would say, if you can comfortably go wider, go wider. Because like I said, if you go narrow, then you're turning it into more of an incline press. Again, this assumes that you're doing it for primarily bodybuilding purposes.
That's true. I guess this is for the lateral head and the rear. Is there anything to add other than what we discussed? The rear head. You hit
the rear head better with all of the modifications we just discussed. And then if you add the pulling exercises and stuff, it should be okay. Add more volume of high pulls, shoulder pulls, rear high rows. And the last thing I would probably add is that you also want to add stretch-mediated hypertrophy exercises for the delts.
Mm-hmm.
So I like cable lateral raises a lot more than doubles. I like side lying lateral raises, where you're lying out to the side and you overload the bottom position more, because normally people, when they do lateral raises, they only overload again the 90-degree top. Like people focus way too excessively on the pump and the burn, as opposed to stretch-mediated hypertrophy and like long muscle lengths. You don't feel as much on long muscle lengths, very little. In fact, sometimes you feel a stretch, but sometimes you just feel very little. But we know from research that's where you get the most growth. So with rear delts, you can also do that with cables, and you can also kind of do a slightly, you can do kind of a lying type of, or side lying rear delt raise to also stretch the rear delts a bit more on the load. If you do only like standard row type movements, then you don't hit the rear delts as much. I do think it helps a lot if you let the shoulder blades drift forward in the bottom of like high rows and row movements. Chin ups as well, like let your shoulders come all the way up, like go into a full dead hang, let the body just drape all the way down, stretch the traps, the rear delts fully, etc. That probably helps a lot. And there's really no risk. Like you never see anyone injure themselves during at the end of a row or something. You know, so there are a lot of people say no, you need to keep the shoulder blades a little bit up during chin ups and the like. There's zero evidence to support any of that. And anecdotally, you don't see anyone injure themselves like during a death hang and a chin up, like at the bottom, very bottom position. You're like, oh no, it's always in the middle or somewhere else. You know, if they get injured in the first place.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And it came to my mind, would you count a lat prayer as a rear delt exercise, especially in the bottom position where you slightly go hyperextension?
Yeah, so the lateral delts also extend the shoulder. They are primarily shoulder hyperextensors. They are more active then, but they're also very active during shoulder extension. So lat prayer, when done well, actually also hits the rear delts very well.
Mm-hmm. And I guess with the time we have left, we can slightly talk about the last upper body muscle, which is the back. And I like to divide the back into two parts. The upper part, which goes with the traps and the rear delt, and the lower part I would call the lats. And especially these days, I've been seeing a lot of variations to the lats and so many angles, and you have to pull horizontal, you have to pull frontal, and you have to work your iliac fibers, and so many things that's been going on these days with the lats. So let's hear it from the man. How are things with the lats, and how would you put a structure a program to work the lats properly?
There is something to be said for the lats to target shoulder adduction, which is basically like a wide grip type lat pull down or pull up, versus extension, which is more what you get with supinated close grip chin up or lat prayers. You hit more upper versus lower fibers with different variants. So there is some research indicating that. Whether it's still relevant at maximum training intensity is debatable. We know that fibers that have the best direct orientation for the line of pull from the exercise, they are more active. But if you're training close to failure, all the fibers get activated. Like it's all hands on deck, everything gets worked. So whether it's still very relevant then, that's currently debatable. I think if you have those two movements, like you have a more wide grip, a wide pull down, for example, and a lat prayer, you're pretty much covered. So I don't think you need like 6 different angles and diagonally down and hit those fibers and the other fibers. Just 2 good exercises are probably okay for the very most part. Maybe super advanced trainees, you'll benefit from one more, but if you want to do high volume, you'll work them for other exercises anyway.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny because lat prayer, ever since you wrote the article on your website about lat prayer and how they work so many muscles and different muscles, I've been starting to implement them on my program, and I've been doing them for such a long time now. At some point, my core started failing before my lats, which got really difficult. So I switched to unilateral lat prayers. which was much easier. But then I have not the same problem. It's much easier, and you can actually fail in the lats before you fail in your core. But sometimes you have to stabilize yourself since you're pulling in one direction or half your body. But it's such a great exercise. I highly recommend anyone who's watching this to try this.
If you struggle with the core being the limiting factor, then you can, with body positioning, you can reduce the effect a lot. Kneeling also helps a lot. Like standing, it's harder. And what you can also do with the kayak version, which I got from the late John Meadows, is he didn't use it for lat prayer specifically, but he used it for, I think, kayak rows, which is, or like standard type pull downs. You basically, you start like this, just like a normal lat prayer, and then you move only one hand into your hip. And the other hand is kind of, so it's like a kayak, you're doing it like this, you can alternate, or you can just do one side and then the other side, but I like to alternate between sides. And you just naturally move, like this arm, this hand goes to the left hip, exact same position as normal, but the other hand, you just let it kind of stay near the top, and it just goes, you kind of press down into it. It's a kayak lat prayer. So it's also this great variant, you don't need as much weight, and it's not fully unilateral, so you kind of alternate between the sides. And you also feel it hits the fibers a little bit different because you're using these different angles, so it's a nice variant as well when you've done lots of normal lat prayers already.
I must try this one. I will definitely give it a try. It sounds like something I would do. Okay, and for the upper back, just to keep it short and simple with the time we have left, for myself, I'm a big fan of shoulder pulls. I can really feel my upper back contracting, especially the upper traps. And contrary to shrugs, this feels much more, that activates the traps or the upper traps, especially while doing shoulder pulls. Basically, shoulder pulls, instead of doing a face pull, which you go up and you go to the shoulder direction rather than going to the face pulls or the face direction. What do you have to say for the upper backs?
Yeah, for the upper back, you want to kind of differentiate biomechanically between the traps, which have the lower, the middle, and the upper fibers, which are literally called that because they're either horizontal, trending down, or trending up. And the rear delts, which we already discussed. I like shoulder pulls a lot, type high row type movements in general. I don't do a lot of normal rows because they're not ideal for the lats, and because you're not getting that full range of motion, you're not getting stretch medial hypertrophy. And when you're moving the lat or the elbow behind the body, you're hyperextending the shoulder, and the lats cannot do anything in that position. The lats only bring the elbow back to your side. They cannot pull it further back. So most rows kind of, they don't cut it for the lats, and they're no better than a high row for the upper back. So I like to just focus on the upper back with rowing type movements and really focus on the rear delts, the traps. Whether you hit more upper trap or not depends a lot on the angle. If you move the hip a little bit up, more like an upright row, you will hit the upper traps a lot more. For the upper traps though, most research finds that to really hit them, you need to be in shoulder abduction to some degree. So the elbows need to be somewhat up like this because the fibers, they run almost horizontal for the most part. So the way most people do shrugs, they think the fibers run like this. If you have a super thick neck, maybe they do. But for most people, they run more like this, which means that you want the angle of pull, again, also to be more like this, because the fibers, they will contract this way, right? So you want like a high or a wide shrug, the wide barbell shrug, or like dual cable pulley shrug. You can also do overhead shrugs or even monkey shrugs. Monkey shrugs, it's like this. It's not very practical. Most people don't like them, but theoretically they work well. So I like those a lot if you really want to focus on the upper traps. Many people don't though, because it creates more. You kind of reduce the width of the shoulder, visually speaking. When you make this part very big, then kind of you don't have that long, broad shoulder look. So for aesthetic purposes, many people don't want to maximize upper trap growth, and they're fine with just doing the shoulder pulls, horizontal type movements, and not focusing too much on the traps specifically. But if you do want to grow them, you should probably add some wide grip type shrugs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in the same context, would you say, for example, wide grip chest supported T-bar, would you count it towards the upper traps? because it works the upper back, and then you have the wide grip, and then you will pull in that direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's scenario where I would somewhat go by feel, because it depends on the angle of your individual trap fibers, which, you know, if you look at the fibers of, say, Arnold versus Ziz versus average strongman powerlifter guy, usually they're more like this, and with Ziz they're really like this. So the individual fibers of the individual versus the exact angle of the movement. Like if it's more of an upright row, you'll hit the upper traps more. Whereas if you're fully horizontal, you're not going to hit them much at all.
Mm-hmm.
You may feel it, but it's going to be more like the top of the horizontal fibers rather than really these upper fibers. Because the top fibers of the traps, they go all the way up to the neck.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that's 1 hour of your time. I want to stretch this further. We try to get as many muscles as I believe we covered the upper body completely.
We can do a part 2.
So
no problem.
This must be a second part. So where we talk about the lower body. I guess we can talk about that later. We'll see how this goes and the feedback of the people. I'm sure that everyone's going to love this episode. There's a lot of information to digest here. So I'll probably watch it myself for 2 or 3 times just so I can grasp everything here. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, Menno. I mean, we've been trying to get this to work for the last 2 to 3 weeks. I'm glad it finally happened, and I hope you get well soon, or recover completely from your back injury, where you can go back with as much as you can lift and deadlift or squats.
Yeah, contact, let me know when it's up. I'll be sure to share it, and I will do a part 2.
We'll do, definitely. And for anyone watching, I'll leave all the links below for Menno's channel, his Instagram, his YouTube channel, which he launched recently, and his PT course. I believe you started this year. No, you're starting in a couple of months, I believe, the next batch of people.
Pretty soon in May. May is this year's batch.
Yeah, this is highly recommended. This is one of the best courses I've ever done. And you also have your Patreon. So I also highly recommend that. Live every month. There's a lot of information. So you're a busy man. So I envy you. You're such a hard worker. I need to take your recipe from that. Thank you, Menno.
Right,
Thank you, Menno.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Same.
Have a great day. Bye.